Now, every culture directs its members to form an identity in a particular way. The culture doesn't ask your permission, and the culture doesn't even tell you what it's doing. It just says this is how it's done.
Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Eric Cohn, executive producer. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line on our website at acton.org/actonline. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. For this episode of Acton Line, we're bringing you the remarks by Reverend Timothy J. Keller at the Acton Institute's annual dinner in 2018, in which he spoke on identity, business, and the Christian gospel. Keller, the founding pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City, New York Times bestselling author, teacher, and arguably the most influential evangelical preacher of his generation, died May 19, 2023, after a 3-year struggle with pancreatic cancer. He was 72. He leaves behind his wife of 48 years, Kathy, and 3 sons, David, Michael, and Jonathan. Keller's winsome appeal and professorial demeanor grew an exploratory prayer group in 1989 to a 5,000-plus member megachurch in the heart of the Big Apple, a supposed desert wasteland for spirituality. His impact on urban church planting, his ability to speak in a forthright and non-condescending manner to skeptics, and his deliberate avoidance of political partisanship were just a few qualities that made him stand out in a world of so-called celebrity preachers and would-be chaplains to the rich and famous. His intellectual curiosity, wedded to a personal humility, were also hallmarks of his unique ministry. Through such books as The Reason for God, The Prodigal God, Generous Justice, and Making Sense of God, Keller argued for the centrality of the gospel of Jesus Christ and his all-sufficient sacrifice in a world of idols and, quote, self-made men and women. As he liked to sum it up, the gospel is this: we are more sinful and flawed in ourselves than we ever dared believe. Yet at the very same time, we are more loved and accepted in Jesus Christ than we ever dared hope. Taped just a few weeks before his death, he left behind one final message for Redeemer Presbyterian Church and any who would wish to follow in his footsteps. Quote, "Forget about your reputation. Jeremiah 45:5. Seekest thou great things for thyself? Seek them not. Ministers, don't make your ministry success your identity. People, don't make getting a big name in New York City your main thing. Lift up Jesus' name. Hallowed be thy name. Forget yourself." For those who had the honor to hear him, to be counseled by him, to be challenged by him, he will never be forgotten.
I would like to talk to you about something that I think you'll see the relevance as I go on, but maybe at first you wonder how it all relates. If I was going to give a title to my address, it would be Identity, Business, and the Christian Gospel. I don't believe that you can understand our modern culture without understanding the unique modern understanding of identity. What I'm about to tell you, to a great degree, comes from a great book on that subject by Charles Taylor, the Catholic philosopher who 30 years ago almost wrote a book called Sources of the Self, The Making of Modern Identity. An identity is an answer. Your personal identity is an answer to 3 questions. To what do I aspire? What am I worth? And who gets to say? To what do I aspire is you got to live for something. Everyone's living for something. There's something that is the main thing in your life. Whatever that is will define you. What am I worth is actually the sense of self-worth that comes from an assessment of whether or not I'm reaching that highest good, or whether I'm honoring it, or whether I'm achieving it. So I'm defined by whatever is the main thing I'm living for. And then my self-worth comes from whether or not I'm achieving that or honoring that. And then lastly, who gets to say what your self-worth is? Who gets to evaluate you? And when you answer those three questions, you've got a personal identity. Now, every culture directs its members to form an identity in a particular way. The culture doesn't ask your permission, and the culture doesn't even tell you what it's doing. It just says this is how it's done. In order to be a real conscious citizen of a particular culture and not just a pawn of it, you have to make the particular way that culture forms identity visible to yourself, or you're just going to be carried along with it. That's what I like to do. Let's talk about what is unique about modern identity, and then how it creates a problem, especially for people in business, or the particular ways for people in business, and then how the gospel is the answer, the way forward. First of all, what do we mean by the unique modern identity? I'm going to oversimplify. The only way for us to ever be finished and for you to be at all interested is if I oversimplify, okay? And therefore, I'm going to talk about traditional identity and modern identity. Traditional identity is the way every culture used to form identity and the way non-Western cultures still do. And modern identity is the way Western cultures do, and increasingly so. Now, traditional identity is outside in. You first go out and find that highest good, something outside of yourself, God, family, moral truth, nation, your community. And after you find out what that highest good is, you come back in and you rearrange your life and you make the sacrifices necessary in order to align yourself with that. And your self-esteem is actually the honor that your community bestows on you if you sacrifice your own selfish interests for that higher good. Modern identity is exactly the opposite. It's inside out. See, traditional identity is you go outside to find out what the highest good is, then you come inside and rearrange your life for it. Modern identity is you go in first. You go in and look at your deepest desires. You go in and look at your deepest feelings and dreams, and you decide what those are. And then you go out and you tell everybody, family, church, community, that they have to make the changes. They have to adjust to accommodate you. And you are the only validator. Your community is not your validator. Your community does not get to say, because only you can assess your own worth and value. So there it is. Traditional identity, you are your duties. And your self-esteem comes from the honor that your community bestows on you as you sacrifice your selfish interests for the greater good. But modern identity is you are your desires, you're not your duties. And your self-esteem is the dignity you bestow on yourself when you assert who you are against any claims that church or state or family or God have on you. Charles Taylor says the modern self is what he calls a buffered self, which means there's a hard coating. Older selves, you might say traditional selves, were porous. Now, what does that mean? Older selves felt the pull of things outside. God or family or the needs of my country or the needs of my community are in some ways more real than my inner desires. That's what's real. And my inner desires, they come and go, and I've got to bring this into alignment with that. But in a buffered self, or you might say a hard-coded self, there's no feel. The modern self doesn't feel the pull of anything outside. Your feelings are more real than any claims from outside. Your feelings are more real, which means, by the way, when a traditional self adopts a belief, a religious belief, that traditional self adopts the religious belief because it's true and because it's actually more real and more important than my feelings that go back and forth. But when a modern self adopts a religious belief, it only adopts a religious belief if it fits in with the way you like to see yourself. Because what's inside is more real than what's outside. And therefore, all religious beliefs in a modern self are very, very thin, and they're discardable because they're basically accessories for the kind of self that you want to be. Examples, in order to help you and help me. Let me give you at least three. I love giving examples, but I can only give so many tonight. Let me give you one that any of you who have a daughter or a granddaughter would know. There's a very interesting a song in a Walt Disney movie, I think it is, that was a very pop culture phenomenon a few years ago, in which you actually see one of the characters abandoning the traditional self and adopting a modern self right before your very eyes. It's Elsa in Frozen. Because in an earlier stanza, she says what? Don't let them in, don't let them see. You must be the good girl you always are meant to be. Conceal, don't feel, don't let them know. That is a caricature of the traditional self. It's saying, whatever's inside, you hide it, and what you do is you bring it into alignment with what's outside. But then, of course, what she does, when she gets into the next stanza, and she says, it's time to see what I can do, test the limits and break through. No right, no wrong, no rules for me, I'm free. That's the modern self. Let it go. Let it go. Can't hold it in anymore. So what's inside is what rules. What's outside, right or wrong, rules? No. What's inside is more real than what's outside. That's the modern self. It used to be what's outside was more important, was more real than what's inside. That was the traditional self. And right before your very eyes. It's almost, by the way, when she's wearing the cloak, that's the traditional self. And then when she goes all glam, that's the modern self. And there's a number of you that are saying, what in the world are you talking about? You're probably a single man. Just want you to know that. That's right. Ask some female nearby and they'll tell you. Okay. On a slightly more serious note, by the way, though it's still go to the pop culture, a few years ago, well, it's still out there. George Bernard Shaw's play St. Joan was on Broadway. I think it's still on Broadway. And when it first came out, it was reviewed. And the New York Times Review said it was the name of the review was Joan of Arc and the Monotony of Sainthood. And what it said was very simple. It said we can't relate to these saints. They hear from God and then they go off and there's no inner self-doubt and there's no wrestling because they're just so sure that they're right and therefore they're boring. But not only that, they're phonies. Now, and if you read through, what they're actually saying is, we don't believe that the traditional self was a real self. We don't believe there is anything more real than the inner self. We don't believe there's anything out there that's real. And therefore, modern people, the modern self is more interesting because we're always wrestling and we're never sure of ourselves. And am I doing the right thing? Is this who I am? Have I really? By the way, a perfect example, and here I go to pop culture. J.R.R. Tolkien was a world-class scholar in Old English, Anglo-Saxon literature. He understood that in epic sagas in the old days, heroes did not have a modern self. They had a traditional self. But when the Lord of the Rings was put into cinematic form, you have Frodo saying to Gandalf, who can I trust? And Gandalf says, trust yourself, Frodo. Trust your own inner strength. Tolkien would never have said such a thing. Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings, the king, is just filled with inner angst about, is this who I am? And I don't think I've got what it takes. They couldn't help themselves. Peter Jackson, who made The Lord of the Rings, kept saying, I'm trying to really honor J.R.R. Tolkien, but actually he cannot conceive of anything but a modern self. And he tried so hard. Here's one more thing. And by the way, this is another thing. You single men, you can tune out the next 90 seconds as well. Because we have bought our granddaughters certain gifts, I regularly get a catalog, American Girl. And you do remember, I think, that the purpose of dolls at one time, among other things, was to help girls get ready to fit into a family, to get ready to, for right now, I do have twin grandchildren right now who are under the age of 1 month. And by the way, well, yeah, individualism doesn't work when you've got twins. You say, what about me? And what about my needs? And what about me? You forget about that. But you see, originally dolls were a way for girls to say, this is what it means to fit in. This is what it means to fit into a family and to take on these certain roles. But that's not what American Girl says the doll's for now. Here's what it says. It says, these dolls will let her know, that your daughter or granddaughter, that her individuality is something to celebrate every day. Every girl has her own story. Every girl has the stuff that makes her her. Every girl has the things that set her apart from every other girl. Given the chance to express exactly who you are, how will you share your own inner star? These dolls will help you. In other words, you choose the doll to help you express your own inner star. It's a modern self, not traditional self. Now, and do you see, the culture doesn't ask your permission. The culture just blasts you with it, and nobody knows there's any other way to do it. But it's created problems, and let me talk about a few of them. Let me give you the cultural problems at a kind of higher level, and then talk about how it affects us in the professions, and especially, I'll mention the business world. Anyway, there's 4 reasons why the modern self, in many ways, is a very problematic thing. One is the modern self is incoherent. If you go inside first and decide who you want to be and who you are by looking at your own inner feelings and desires, the fact of the matter is, as we all know, they're incoherent. They contradict each other. They contradict each other, and they change. Even Freud knew this, by the way. They contradict each other, so you can't go in there and figure out who you are by looking. The way I try to make it, I try to explain this to younger people. I say, you remember when you were 20? When you were 20, you could think back at your 15-year-old self, and you realized your 15-year-old self was pretty much an idiot. What your 15-year-old self thought was important, you're pretty much an idiot. But then your 25-year-old self could look back at your 20-year-old self and say, you were pretty much an idiot. Now, then it slows down a little bit. Your 35-year-old self can certainly see your 25-year-old self, you were kind of an idiot. You see what's going on? We're all idiots right now. Right now, we're idiots. We're idiots to our future self, if you live long enough. Which means, how in the world do you look inside and say, this is who I am? Because you're 30, 10 years from now, you're going to look back and say, no. A Christian writer, Francis Spufford, puts it like this. He says, if you really understand yourself, quote, you are a being whose wants make no sense, don't harmonize, whose desires deep down are discordantly arranged, so that you truly want to possess and you truly want not to at the very same time. If you look at your desires, you will find that you're equipped for farce and even tragedy much more than you are for happy endings. So you look inside. The modern self is incoherent. Secondly, the modern self is extremely fragile. Now, this is where Charles Taylor is brilliant. Charles Taylor says, when you tell yourself, don't let anybody define you, you look inside and you decide who you want to be, and you don't let anybody tell you what is right or wrong for you. And only you can validate yourself. He says the trouble is we are irreducibly relational creatures. We have to, nobody can really say, everybody else in the world thinks I'm a monster, but I don't care. I like myself. You're not going to be able to say that. But see, if you tell yourself only I am the ultimate validator, and you don't give that right to anybody, you don't give it to your family or your community, you know what that means? You're going to be radically insecure, and you're going to need constant affirmation. You say, no, I validate myself, but that doesn't work. You're going to need constant affirmation. It's the reason why civility is breaking down, because to disagree with me is basically to undermine my identity. It's the reason why to bolster your fragile sense of self-worth, because it's very fragile. Whenever you're trying to validate yourself, you're never sure you've lived up to your own standards. And it's the reason why we can't look at other people as just being wrong or mistaken. We demonize them. It's a way of bolstering. You're awful. That's how I feel good. Or I love this quote from Madonna in an old Vogue magazine interview, where she says, my drive in life is from the fear of being mediocre. That's always pushing me. I push past one spell of it, and then I feel I can discover myself as a special human being. But then I feel I'm still mediocre and uninteresting unless I do something else. Even though I have become somebody, I still have to prove that I'm somebody. And that's exactly what Taylor's saying. The modern self is incredibly fragile because it's based completely on your performance. I mean, there's something stifling about the traditional identity in traditional lands where if my mother and father think I'm a good person, then I feel fine. Well, that can be a little stifling if your mother and father are unreasonable people. But you realize how much easier that is than trying to prove it to yourself and to the whole world that you're great in business or you're beautiful or you're smart or you're this or you're that. Thirdly, the modern identity, besides being incoherent, extremely fragile, does fragment culture. Now, here's something I don't think I need to belabor because we all know about this, but as Charles Taylor says at one place, he says, communities are eroding, families, neighborhoods, even the polity. People are less willing to participate, to do their bit, and they are less trusting of others and indeed of any institutions or authority of any kind. Because you see, we're buffered cells, and we don't take to anybody telling us how to live our lives. And I recently read an interesting book, an essay by a modern woman who was talking about that if you have a modern self, why parenting is so hard for young people. And what she said was very simple. She says, every single other relationship in modern society now is transactional. Even marriage. If I'm not getting what I want out of it, I'm out of here. Every relationship is transactional. The trouble, she said, is you can't do that with kids. You can't divorce your 3-year-old, even though a lot of modern people want to do it. So what do you do? If you have a modern self, which means all relationships have to be transactional, nothing out here is more important than what's in here. Nothing. Well, then what do? You don't have kids. And so the birth rate goes on like this. And so families, marriages don't happen and families don't happen. Here's one last thing. The modern self is actually an illusion. It can't happen. It doesn't really happen. Here's an illustration I try to give. I know it's a bit of a daring illustration, but I think it's fair. We say, no, we don't let anybody out here tell us what is right or wrong for us. We go in and we decide who we are, and we, in a sense, are self-created. Nah, no, you don't. Imagine, I have to go to Europe to do this. Imagine a man walking down the streets of London in the 800 years ago. He's Anglo-Saxon. He's in the shame and honor culture. And he looks inside his heart and he sees two things. One thing he sees is aggression. When people cross him, he loves to kill them. Okay. The other thing he sees in his heart is same-sex attraction. Okay. So what's he going to do? He's going to look at the aggression. He's going to say, that's me. Because it's a shame and honor culture. Warrior, right? That's me. He's going to say, that's me. The same-sex attraction, he's going to say, no, I think I need to put a lid on that. Today, you walk down the streets of London, let's say you're a young man, and you look into your heart, and you see two different things. You see aggression, that when people cross you, you just want to kill them, and you see same-sex attraction. What are you going to do? You're going to look at the aggression, you're going to say, I need therapy. You're going to say, I need anger management. That's not me. And then you go look at the same-sex attraction, you say, well, that is me. That's who I am. No, it's not. Your culture. In both cases, how liberated we are today. Thank goodness we're not like those ancient Anglo-Saxons. I'm sorry. Both those guys are doing what their culture tells them. They're not really looking inside and deciding who they are. They're taking a moral grid that's been brought in from outside, and through that moral grid, they're sifting what is really them and what's not really them. It's inevitable. You've got to bring a moral grid in from outside. You've got to bring moral standards in from outside. And you have to have validation from outside. And therefore, ultimately, the modern self doesn't work. Let me give you really fast 5 ways in which, listen, we are all, excuse me, Kathy hates it when I start a sentence and stop. That's my wife, by the way. The fact is that all of us are, to some degree, modern selves. Even those of us who are out there saying, yeah, I hate that modern self stuff. And I'm a okay. Well, we all, to a great degree, we're living in the water. We're all fish in this water to a great degree. I'm actually trying to help you resist it by making it more visible to you right now. But the fact is we're all affected by it. And those of us in the professions in the business world are too. Dr. David Martin Lloyd-Jones, who was a physician before he was British, Welsh physician before he became a preacher. I heard once a very interesting lecture he gave to the Christian Medical Society in London at one point, and he actually talked about this danger. He says, an awful lot of my friends would, he says, if you were going to give them an epitaph on their grave, you'd have to say, born a man, died a doctor. And what he said is, in the modern world, because we don't get our identity from God and from family and things like that, we tend to get it from our performance. We need to, because we're trying to bolster our fragile sense of identity. And so what we do is, especially, we look, if we're doctors or lawyers or in business, and if we're successful, that becomes our bottom line identity. It's spiritually a horribly dangerous situation. The only parable of Jesus Christ, when Jesus tells a parable, these are parables, they're fiction. The only parable in which a person has a name is the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16. Now, most commentators have really, really struggled. Why in the world, the Good Samaritan doesn't have a name? The parable, the prodigal son and the elder brother, they don't have names, the father. Why in the world would Jesus Christ put a name in this? And the answer is, I think the best answer is, it's Jesus' way of trying to say that Lazarus has a name, but the rich man doesn't have a name because that's all he is. He's a rich man or he's nothing. His riches is his identity. I knew of a couple of guys who were actors in the early days of Redeemer. They were both actors and they were in my church. And one of them I thought was actually been a Christian a lot longer than the other. And they both were after really great roles. They knew that if they were auditioning for roles, that if they got it, it would make or break their career, maybe. And neither of them got their role. Neither of them got the part. And the one that I thought would have been more of a longtime Christian went into this incredible spiral, substance abuse, never could actually do anything else, kept trying and trying and trying in acting and just wouldn't give it up. And the other guy said, maybe I'm not supposed to be an actor. This is horribly disappointing, and went on and did something else and had a pretty good life. And I came to realize that one guy acting was just a good thing. And it was a huge disappointment when he didn't get the role. But for the other guy, acting was his bottom line. In other words, he's an actor, he's nothing. See, that's what hell is. You don't have any identity. You don't have a name because born a man, died a doctor. Born a man, died a businessman. Born a man or woman, died an actor. That's all you are. Now, what that leads to is 5 things quick. Workaholism. Workaholism means you have no limits. You go beyond where you work beyond the limits that are going to hurt your body. It's going to hurt your family. Why do you do it? Because making money or this particular profession is you're getting very quiet here, is your identity. Let me a little disclosure here. Some years ago, my wife came to me and said, we're both pretty self-controlled when it comes to spending, but not you in one area and only one area, books. She says, you really just buy them. You don't even say, well, what's the budget here? And then she said, she pushed me on this. And she says, you don't have any problem with clothes. Well, the answer is, I'm not going to get any self-worth out of how I look, no matter what I do. But a book meant to me more information. So I'm a teacher. I'm a preacher. I want to be seen as smart. And when people say, oh, that's so smart, he's so smart, he tells me this, he tells me that. And that's the reason why I had no limits on writing on books, but I had plenty of limits when it came to clothing. Because see, if something becomes your identity, you don't have any limits. You're addicted to it. And you got to confront that. Workaholism is, you have adopted the modern identity and now you're in business or whatever your profession is. So there's the workaholism. The second thing is you might say the success failure whiplash. If your identity has become your business and your profession, then when you're successful, it does literally go to your head. And what I mean by that is this. If you're successful at making money, which means you're really good at making money, you start to believe you're an expert on everything. And nobody will tell you that because they're kind of afraid of you. But the fact is, you really feel like I'm an expert on art, I'm an expert on ministry, I'm an expert on everything. And that's a sign of idolatry. That is a sign that what's happened is that you've turned your success into an identity, that you're not just good at making money, you're good. You're not just important, you're not just prominent in business, you're prominent, you're important. You've made it. And then, of course, success goes to your head, but any kind of failure, you saw what I gave you the example of the actor. Success goes to your head, but failure goes right through your heart. Because you don't have a self left. You don't have a self left. Another sign that you've turned business or your profession into a modern identity is the inability to critique yourself. Some years ago, there was a guy who wrote an article in the New York Times about why he got out of writing. He was a writer. His name was Benjamin Nugent. And he says, I came to the place where I realized my writing was getting pretty bad because I couldn't actually interrogate it. He says, I needed for it to be good, so I couldn't look at it and really see where it was flawed. And then he has this great line. He says, I made the quality of my work the measure of my worth. And when it had become an identity, it actually started to eat him up because he really wasn't in a position where he could get better as a writer, and so he got out. A fourth problem is the short-term, long-term thing. There's a woman named Erin Callahan. It's an illusion. Erin Callahan was a woman who in 2013, she wrote an article in the New York Times that she had become a pretty wealthy businesswoman by the time she was 40. And she said she actually wrote, and she retired basically from business, and now she owned a couple of homes, and she was trying to, plant a vineyard and that kind of thing. And she actually wrote this incredibly rueful article that said, I've got a lot of men and young men and women saying, great, you burned the candle at both ends for 20 years, you did everything, and now you're able to get out there and live. She says, no, it didn't work. And what she says, which is pretty chilling, she says, she was very unhappy, and she says, see, what I did became who I was, and that is psychologically enslaving. She says to work that kind of time and to make that kind of money meant that when she stepped away from it, she didn't have a self left. She was a successful, hardworking, productive businesswoman, or she was nothing. She was a rich man, or she was nothing. She was an actor, she was nothing. And she says it's psychologically enslaving, which is what Luke 16 is all about. And so she gets back into business. She can't stop working because that had become herself. There's a fifth problem, and that is a lot of people actually choose the wrong jobs that they're really not fit for. But they know it'll bring them more social status. And because of the modern self, we actually don't choose jobs that we love. We don't choose jobs that actually do good for people. We choose jobs that are going to bring us that status because we're so hungry for it. So what's the solution? Is there a solution? Yeah. It's the Christian gospel. And let me just tell you how subtle this is. I am not saying the solution is to get religious. I'm not saying that. Peter, in John 13, Jesus says to Peter, Peter, you're going to deny me. And Peter says, not me, Lord. And he looks around at everyone else and the other disciples. He said, if they all abandon you, maybe they will, but I will never abandon you. If they all abandon you, I will never abandon you, which is another way of him saying, I love you more than any of these other people. Now, how could he not know that he was actually the biggest coward? He actually said, if there's persecution or something like that, I want you to know that I will be the bravest of your disciples. He was actually the most cowardly of his disciples. He denied Christ 3 times. How could he not know that? I'll tell you how he didn't know that. Because it was a false identity. He was not basing his identity, his self-worth, on Christ's love for him. He was basing his identity and self-worth on his love for Christ. That's the reason why, just like Benjamin Nugent said, when he looked into his heart, because his very identity was based on the idea that he was a brave, loving Christian disciple. That was his identity. When he looked into his heart, there was cowardice there, but he just screamed out because he couldn't bear it. Because if he was flawed, if he was a coward, then of course he had no self left. You see how just being religious, just being virtuous, can just be one more version of the modern self, or one more version of what the Bible would call works righteousness, self-salvation. But don't you see, the traditional and the modern self are horizontal because the validators are here on earth, but the Christian identity is unique. It's not traditional and it's not modern. 2 Corinthians 5:21, God made Jesus Christ sin who knew no sin, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. Now, what does it mean when it says God made Jesus sin? It doesn't mean he made him sinful. On the cross, he didn't start snarling and getting filled with pride and anger. He treated him as if he was sinful, which means that when I believe, I am treated, if he's treated as I deserve, I'm treated as he deserves. In other words, God made him sin who knew no sin, to be sin, that I might become the righteousness of God in him. God sees me in Christ. I'm united with him. All Christians understand that. And my flaws are hidden in that sense. And therefore, when God sees me, he sees something beautiful. And that means he's the ultimate validator. And his love for me is unconditional. Now, you realize how different that is? In 1 Corinthians 4, Paul actually says something where he actually shows that both, not that he knew about it particularly, maybe he did by divine revelation, but he rejects both the traditional and the modern self. He says, I do not care what you or any human court thinks about me. He says, I don't care if you or any human court judges me. Yea, I judge not mine own self. My conscience is clear. That does not make me innocent. It's the Lord who judges me. 1 Corinthians 4. Did you hear what he just said? He says, I don't care what you think. That's the traditional self. But then he says, I don't care what I think. My conscience is clear, but that does not make me innocent. Hitler's conscience was clear. That didn't make him innocent. I don't care what you think. I don't care what I think. It's what the Lord thinks of me and Jesus Christ. That is unique. That's freeing. That's absolutely liberating. It changes both the traditional self and the modern self. It's a whole different approach. Let me show you how it works. In Luke chapter 10, I'll give you two examples, I'm done. One from Jesus and one from my own ministry. In Luke chapter 10, Jesus has sent the disciples out to heal and cast out demons. And they come back and they're really on a high. Because they say, wow, Lord, I mean, that's my paraphrase of the text. Even the demons are subject to our name. And they say, well, we got, it's sort of like, have you ever seen that old Donald Duck cartoon? Power, I got power. And they were saying, even the demons are subject to us. And Jesus has the audacity to say, rejoice not that the demons are subject to you, but that your names are written in heaven. Now, that's an amazing statement. What he's saying, he says, I'm not saying that you can't be happy that you've delivered some people from evil. Be happy, but don't make it your name. Don't make it an identity. Say, do you realize that you don't have to wait to the end of your life, and if you're good enough, then maybe you'll go to heaven? Your names are already written in heaven, in me. He says, don't do that to yourself. Don't base your identity on your love for me or your power or your helping people or how successful you are. Don't do that to yourself. Do you want to have a fragile self? No. Rejoice not. It's a command. In other words, don't over-rejoice in the good things that you're doing, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven. That's right from Jesus. One example of this, I learned this years ago when I was still a young minister, didn't know better. I was talking to a woman who had had a terrible life because she was very pretty when she was young, and as a result, she kind of always had guys after her, and she turned men into an identity. That is, she said, I know that because I'm pretty and I always have these guys are after me, then I know I'm okay. And of course, what that did, what it meant was she needed men to love her, and as a result, she was constantly getting into abusive relationships. So at one point, she broke loose from that, and she became a Christian. At the same time, she got some pretty good counseling, but she was going to a therapist who says, you've built your identity on men. What you need is a career. And you can feel good about yourself because you will be a successful businesswoman. And she says, that's interesting. She says, you're asking me to get rid of a common fallacious female identity and enter into a common fallacious male identity. So I'll be just as enslaved to how the stock market does as I really was to how the guys look at me. She says, I don't want either. And I was such a young minister at the time, trying to minister to her, and she taught me. She says, here's what I do. Colossians chapter 3, the first 3 verses, where it says, you died and you've been raised with Christ, and now you are raised with Christ, and when Christ, who is our life, appears, you will appear with him in glory. And it all talks about how Jesus is your life, and you are alive in him. And she says, if I see a guy looking at me, in the old days I used to say, come hither. But she says, now, inside my heart, it doesn't mean he might be a great guy. But she says, what I have to do inside my heart is I have to say this. You're kind of nice looking, but you will never be my life. Christ is my life. And she said, that's the only reason why it's safe for me to even look at men now, even think about getting married. She said, unless I get my identity from Christ's love for me, I will never love my husband enough. I'll crush him with my expectations because I'll need him to be my ultimate validator. You get it? The gospel. Look, you know what? That sounded more like a sermon than a lecture, so I feel the need to pray. Forgive me. Let me close my remarks with prayer for a moment. Our Father, I thank you for showing us not only something about what we struggle with, but something about how ultimately your salvation in Christ is so helpful, is so crucial, without which we can do nothing, without which we cannot live. I pray that you'd apply what I've said to everyone's hearts here in whatever way they need it to be applied. I ask it through Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you'd like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Eric Cohn.